I had just arrived at my lake cabin after a long week of work. The sun was setting and the orange glow danced across the water as I parked my truck near the garage. I felt that familiar peace that always came when I stepped onto this property. It was my escape from the noise of the city and the stress of daily life. I grabbed the keys and unlocked the cabin door, smiling at the thought of a quiet evening by the fireplace. But the silence did not last long. A sharp voice rang out behind me. "What do you think you are doing?" I turned and saw my neighbor Karen standing at the edge of the driveway, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing with suspicion. "I live here," I said calmly, trying to avoid conflict. "This is my cabin." Karen let out a laugh that was more like a scream. "No, this is my vacation home, and you are trespassing." I was stunned for a moment. This woman lived 2 streets away, and I had never seen her near my property before. Now she was claiming it as her own. Before I could respond, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I am calling the police," she shouted loud enough for the birds to scatter from the trees. "You are breaking into my vacation home and stealing my things." I stood there in disbelief, watching her pace back and forth while holding the phone to her ear. She was giving the dispatcher my description, like I was some criminal caught red-handed. I tried to stay calm, but anger began to rise. This was harassment, plain and simple. All I wanted was a quiet evening, and now I had an entitled neighbor accusing me of theft on my own property. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the stillness of the lake air. 2 patrol cars pulled up and the officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the dusk. Karen ran up to them, wildly pointing in my direction. "There he is, that man broke into my vacation home. He is a thief." The officers turned to me, their expressions serious. "Sir, can you explain what is going on here?" I took a deep breath and reached into my pocket, pulling out my cabin keys and property documents that I always kept on hand. "This is my cabin," I said slowly. "I own this land, and I can prove it." The officers exchanged a look while Karen continued to yell behind them, insisting the cabin was hers and that I was lying. The situation was quickly becoming surreal. Neighbors had started to gather nearby, watching from the road, as if it were a live show. Karen was waving her arms around, shouting that I was dangerous, while I stood there trying not to lose my temper. The officers asked me to step aside as they looked over the documents and walked toward the cabin door. Karen followed close behind, still screaming that she had been robbed and that everything inside was hers. I watched as the officers unlocked the door with my keys and stepped inside, shining their flashlights across the wooden interior. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, and every memory inside belonged to me. Yet Karen stood there insisting it was all stolen from her vacation home. The crowd of neighbors murmured as the officers looked from Karen to me, their expressions beginning to shift from suspicion to confusion. And then one officer turned back toward her and asked a question that made the entire gathering fall silent. "Ma'am, can you provide proof that this cabin belongs to you?" the officer asked, his voice steady but firm. Karen froze for a moment, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words that would not come. "Of course it is mine," she finally snapped. "I come here every summer. Everyone knows it." The officer raised an eyebrow and glanced at the neighbors who had gathered along the edge of the road. Some shook their heads, slowly others whispered to one another, clearly doubting her. "Do you have a deed or paperwork to show us?" the second officer asked. Karen crossed her arms tightly and stomped her foot on the gravel driveway. "I do not need paperwork," she shouted. "This man is a thief and he should be arrested." The officer looked back at me, holding the documents I had given him earlier. The papers clearly had my name printed across them, the county seal pressed firmly into the corner. "It is all here, sir," he said quietly enough for only me to hear. "It matches our records." Karen caught the exchange, and her face twisted with frustration. "No, no, you are being fooled," she yelled. "He forged those papers. He probably stole them from me too." Her words only seemed to dig her hole deeper. The neighbors were now openly chuckling, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. The sound of their laughter carried over the still water of the lake. I stayed quiet, watching the officers as they tried to reason with her. But Karen was not interested in reason. She was pacing now, her arms waving dramatically, as if she could convince the crowd with sheer volume. "This is injustice," she cried. "I pay my taxes, I deserve this cabin. The officers exchanged another look then turned to me. "Sir, would you mind unlocking the garage so we can confirm your belongings are here?" I nodded and walked toward the garage door, sliding the key into the lock. With a creak, the door lifted, revealing my fishing gear, my canoe, and stacks of firewood, all neatly arranged, just the way I had left them last season. The officers shined their lights inside and nodded slowly. Everything was in order, nothing seemed stolen, nothing misplaced. But Karen was not done yet. She ran forward, pointing into the garage. "That is my canoe," she screeched. "I bought that last year." The neighbors burst into laughter, this time louder and harder than before. One even shouted out that they had helped me carry that very canoe into the garage 2 summers ago. Karen spun around, her face turning red, her eyes darting from the officers to the crowd, then back to me like a cornered animal trying to find an escape. Karen stomped her foot again, her voice cracking as she shouted over the laughter. "You are all lying. You are all against me. This cabin should have been mine." The officers held up their hands, trying to calm her, but she was too far gone. Her arms flailed as she kept pointing toward the cabin, then at me, as if the louder she yelled, the truer her story would become. One of the officers finally spoke firmly. "Ma'am, you need to stop right now. If you cannot provide proof, then you cannot make these accusations." Karen gasped, as if she had been slapped. "Proof," she cried. "I do not need proof. My word should be enough." The crowd laughed again, and the sound only fueled her anger. She turned on the neighbors, screaming that they were jealous of her and wanted to see her suffer. I stood silently near the garage, watching the scene unfold. It felt like a storm unraveling right in front of me. Her face had turned bright red, her voice shaking with desperation. The second officer quietly asked me if there had been any history with Karen before this night. I shook my head. "No, never. She has never set foot on my property before." The officer sighed and scribbled something in his notepad, glancing up at Karen, who was now pacing back and forth, muttering about conspiracies and thieves. A few of the neighbors had stepped closer, forming a small circle around the drama. Some whispered to me that Karen had been causing problems around the neighborhood for months. Complaints about fences, lawns, even parking spots. But no one had expected her to go this far. Karen suddenly marched toward the cabin door, trying to push past the officer, who quickly blocked her path. She shrieked that she needed to get inside and prove that her belongings were there. The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, you cannot enter this property. It does not belong to you." Karen froze, her chest heaving, her eyes darting wildly, as if the world itself had betrayed her. Then she turned her glare back to me, her fingers stabbing through the air accusingly. "This is not over," she yelled. "I will take what is mine one way or another." The crowd fell silent at her words, the weight of her threat hanging in the cool evening air. The officers stepped forward, their tone sharper now. "Ma'am, I suggest you calm down and think carefully about what you just said." But Karen only raised her chin defiantly. "I know my rights," she barked. "You cannot stop me from getting back what is mine." The first officer let out a slow breath, clearly running out of patience. "Ma'am, you need to understand this property is legally owned and documented. If you continue making threats, we may have to take further action." Karen blinked rapidly, her eyes wet with fury, or maybe frustration. She looked around at the neighbors, who were no longer laughing but watching closely, their phones still recording every word and gesture. I could see her realizing that her dramatic scene had not gained her sympathy. Instead, she was becoming the subject of ridicule and possibly a police report. She stamped her foot again, the gravel scattering under her shoe. "This entire neighborhood is against me," she shouted. "You all want to see me fail." One of the neighbors called out. "No, Karen, we just want you to stop bothering everyone." Her head snapped toward them, her face twisting with rage. She opened her mouth to yell again, but the officer raised a hand, silencing her before she could explode. At that moment, another patrol car pulled up, its headlights sweeping across the driveway. A third officer stepped out, looking at the tense scene and immediately heading toward his colleagues. The new officer spoke quietly with the others and then turned his gaze on Karen, his expression stern. Neighbors whispered among themselves, sensing the situation was escalating further. Karen's defiance seemed to falter for just a second, her eyes darting nervously between the 3 officers, the crowd, and me still standing calmly by the garage. But then she straightened her back, forcing her voice louder. "I will not be silenced. This cabin belongs to me, and no one here will convince me otherwise. The new officer studied her carefully, his arms folded across his chest. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made even the neighbors quiet down. Ma'am, if you truly believe this property belongs to you, then the proper way is through legal channels, not by calling 911 and making accusations without proof. Karen shook her head violently, her hair whipping around. Legal channels are useless, she cried. Everyone is corrupt, everyone is lying to protect him. She pointed at me, her hand trembling with fury. He is the thief, not me. The officer turned his gaze to me, then back to her. Do you have any documents, any receipts, anything at all that shows your claim? Karen's lips quivered, her eyes darted as if she were searching for an answer in the shadows of the trees. Finally, she blurted out, I do not have them with me, but they exist. The neighbors chuckled again, and Karen's face burned with humiliation. She spun around on them, screaming, You will regret laughing at me, all of you will regret this. The second officer stepped closer, his tone warning. Ma'am, you need to stop threatening people. This is a serious situation, and your behavior is making it worse. Karen backed up a step, her heels crunching against the gravel. Her bravado was still there, but now there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She glanced toward the road where more neighbors were gathering, some with their porch lights turned on, watching the spectacle. The crowd had grown larger, and every pair of eyes was fixed on her. Phones were still recording every movement, every word. I stayed quiet, letting the officers handle it. Inside, I could feel a mix of anger and exhaustion. This was supposed to be my peaceful evening, but instead my entitled neighbor had turned it into chaos. Karen suddenly screamed again, her voice cracking. You are all against me because you are jealous that this cabin should be mine. The third officer finally spoke, his tone sharper than before. Ma'am, that is enough. You are disturbing the peace and making false claims. You need to calm down immediately, or we will have to take further action. Karen froze, her chest heaving, her fists clenched at her sides. Her eyes locked on me, burning with a kind of rage that made my stomach twist. The neighbors whispered louder, now wondering what she might do next, as the officers slowly positioned themselves between her and the cabin. Karen took another step back, her eyes darting from one officer to the next, as if she was calculating some way out. The tension in the air was thick, the crowd completely silent. Now, only the sound of the crickets and the gentle ripple of the lake could be heard. One officer spoke in a low, even voice. Ma'am, we are giving you one last chance to step away and end this peacefully. But Karen was not done. She shook her head, her voice rising into a desperate wail. No, I will not leave. This place is mine, and he stole it from me. She jabbed her finger toward me again, her face twisted with anger and desperation. I could see the exhaustion in the officers' eyes, but they held their ground firmly. The neighbors leaned in closer, whispering among themselves, their phone cameras still aimed at Karen, capturing every wild gesture. Karen suddenly tried to rush past the officers again, heading straight for the cabin door. The officers blocked her immediately, their arms outstretched. She struggled against them, her voice breaking into shrill cries. Let me in, let me prove it is mine. The officers restrained her gently, but firmly, guiding her back from the doorway. Her screams echoed across the water, carrying through the night. I stayed still near the garage, my hands clenched, trying not to let my own anger boil over. The scene felt unreal, as if I were trapped in some strange performance with Karen as the star actress. One of the neighbors finally called out, Karen, stop this, everyone knows this cabin has never been yours. Her head snapped toward the voice, her expression twisting further. You are all liars, she screeched. You have all conspired against me from the beginning. The officers exchanged another look, clearly debating what to do next. The third officer stepped slightly closer, his hand resting on his radio, ready to call for more support if she escalated again. Karen was trembling now, not just with rage, but with something else, maybe the realization that the crowd, the officers, and the evidence were all against her. But even then she refused to back down, her voice cracking as she yelled once more. You will all pay for this, you will see, I will make you see. The officers gently guided Karen toward their patrol car, and the crowd watched in stunned silence. One officer spoke quietly to her while the others finished taking notes and speaking with the neighbors. Karen continued to mutter about rights and conspiracies, but her voice had lost much of its earlier fire. They placed her in the back of the patrol car and closed the door while the lights flashed softly across the lake's surface. A neighbor offered to walk me back to the cabin, and we moved slowly across the gravel so as not to disturb the scene. The officers stayed long enough to record statements and to reassure everyone that the matter would be investigated further. I thanked them for their professionalism and handed over an extra copy of my property documents so there would be no ambiguity later. Some neighbors came forward to tell me privately how tired they were of Karen stirring trouble and how relieved they were that the truth had come to light. Others asked if I planned to press charges for harassment or for making false reports to the police. I told them I would consider my options and that for now I only wanted peace at my cabin. They nodded and offered to check on the place while I packed a few things from inside and locked the doors carefully. As I closed the cabin door, I felt the weight of the night settle on me, and the warmth of the wood interior felt like a small island of normalcy. I stood by the window and watched the patrol cars drive away, their taillights disappearing down the lane. Karen sat in the far side of the parking lot until a neighbor kindly suggested she should go home, and then she left with her head bowed, but still muttering under her breath. The crowd slowly dissolved and the lake returned to its usual hush, broken only by distant frogs and the occasional gust of wind. I made a cup of tea and sat in the armchair looking around at the photographs, the books, and the canoe leaning by the wall. Each object seemed to remind me that this place was mine by years of care and memory rather than by the loudness of any claim. A neighbor texted to say they had recorded the incident and that they would share copies if I needed them for any legal steps I might take. I sat with that thought and felt both tired and oddly grateful for the small community that had shown up to witness the truth. Outside, a screen door banged softly as the breeze shifted, and for a moment my heart raced at the echo of the earlier chaos. I walked to the garage and double-checked the locks, then looked at the shoreline where the moonlight painted a silver path on the water. There was a long road ahead of paperwork and perhaps court hearings, but for now I allowed myself to breathe and to listen to the night. The peace did not feel permanent yet, but it felt possible, and that tiny possibility was enough to carry me into the next day and the next step in this messy story. The night stretched on, quiet yet heavy with the echoes of everything that had just happened. I sat in the armchair staring at the flames as they flickered in the fireplace, their glow painting long shadows across the wooden walls. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder than usual. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a reminder that Karen's threat still lingered in the air. I tried to focus on the calm of the lake and the steady rhythm of the water, but my mind kept circling back to her words. "This is not over," she had said. And I believed her. The phone buzzed on the table beside me, and I glanced down to see a message from another neighbor. They warned me that Karen had stormed off earlier, telling anyone who would listen that she would be back with proof that the cabin was hers. The neighbor urged me to be careful and to make sure the locks were secured. I set the phone down and walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking each door and window. The garage was locked, the cabin door secure, the windows latched tight. Still, I could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching from somewhere in the dark beyond the treeline. The lake was calm, but the silence was sharp, like it was waiting for something to break it. The frogs had stopped croaking, and even the crickets seemed quieter than before. I pulled the curtains shut and tried to settle again, but rest would not come. Every sound outside drew me back to the window. Every shadow made me think of Karen's face, twisted with rage as she screamed her accusations. Hours passed, and the fire burned lower until the cabin was wrapped mostly in darkness. I considered calling a friend to come stay the night, but decided against it. This was my cabin, my space, my fight to endure. Still, the thought gnawed at me. What if Karen truly did return? What if she brought more trouble than just loud words and empty threats? I sat by the window staring into the woods, the moonlight breaking through the branches. And in that silence, I could not shake the feeling that this story had only just begun. The moonlight shifted across the lake, casting silver ripples that glimmered through the trees. I sat still by the window, my eyes scanning the dark shoreline, as if it might suddenly come alive with movement. The cabin was quiet, but my thoughts were restless, circling the same question again and again. Was Karen bold enough to return tonight, or would she wait until another day when the memory of police lights and flashing cameras faded? The wood crackled softly in the fireplace, breaking the silence for a moment. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes, but every creak of the cabin kept them snapping open again. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A soft rustle outside made me freeze. I listened closely, my heart thudding, as I tried to separate the sound from the night breeze. It could have been an animal, or it could have been something else. I stood and moved quietly across the room, careful not to let the old floorboards groan under my weight. At the window, I parted the curtain just enough to peek outside. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, but I saw nothing out of place. The garage stood solid, and still, the canoe resting where I had left it. Yet I could not shake the sense of being watched. The same prickling feeling crawled across the back of my neck, the same unease that had haunted me ever since Karen screamed her threats in front of everyone. I let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the glass. The silence pressed down heavier than before, the kind of silence that seemed to have its own presence. The phone buzzed again on the table, startling me in the dark. It was another message from a neighbor. They wrote that they had seen Karen pacing outside her own house earlier, muttering to herself and pointing toward the lake. They ended the message with 3 words that sent a chill through me. Be very careful. The warning from my neighbor echoed in my mind as I set the phone down. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in with the weight of the night. I stood in the center of the room, taking one last slow look at everything I had worked for. The photographs on the mantel, the books stacked neatly on the shelf, the canoe waiting for another summer on the lake. Every detail reminded me this was more than property. It was my home, my peace, my life. I checked the locks one final time, then drew the curtains tight. The unease still lingered, but I refused to let fear take over. Karen's voice might have carried threats, but the truth stood firmly on my side. The lake outside was calm again, the moon high and steady, as if nothing had happened. The neighbors had seen the truth, the officers had the paperwork, and the story was no longer mine alone to defend. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat back down in the armchair. This time, when I closed my eyes, I let the rhythm of the water and the crackle of the fire carry me. The chaos of the evening faded slowly into the stillness of the night. Whatever Karen planned next would have to face not just me, but the truth, the law, and the eyes of everyone who had watched her unravel. And for the first time since the shouting began, I allowed myself to breathe deeply and to feel safe again inside the cabin that had always been mine.